Among our people, all sorts of rumors periodically start to bubble up about a disgraceful peace, and that, God forbid, our diplomats might give something away. And all this simply because the content and the course of negotiations are kept secret. However, it's high time we understood that this is actually the only way to conduct negotiations. Europe and American globalists have shown time and again how they are capable of disrupting any discussion by dragging it through the media and raising cries of Syria, shame on the jungle, and a Kayla missed. Furthermore, the inviolability of certain fundamental principles that Russia adheres to is regularly articulated at the very highest level, and one simply needs to listen and truly hear this. It was recently confirmed one more time. European countries of the Western Bloc are funding the anti-Russian war, which means they cannot be truly interested in finding peace. This was stated at a briefing by Deputy Foreign Minister of the Russian Federation, Mikhail Galuzin. I don't want to name anything again, no specific names, but how should we interpret the declaration from the head of the Foreign Policy Agency of one of the NATO member states that European NATO members ought to be at the negotiating table because they are paying for this war? So, how do you imagine a state or group of states participating in negotiations who believe they must be in the room at the negotiating table because they are paying for the war? I mean, the people who are paying for the war, they should be sitting at negotiations where the discussion is about finding peace. But still, I would probably wish that those figures in the West who think that way would somehow reformat their thinking and tune into the wave of seeking peace, not funding war. That's what I'd say, he added, without mentioning that the US supports this war with everything necessary, profiting from it. Let's remind everyone once again that this was an official briefing. Maria Zakharova often makes some of her statements through her personal Telegram channel, and these, it sometimes seems, have a slightly less official status. But here, the Deputy Foreign Minister himself spoke officially. That's it. Higher than that are only Lavrov and Putin themselves, and it was clearly stated, Europe is the force that is fueling the war. There's absolutely no point or logic in talking to her about peace for this very reason. Europe doesn't want peace. She constantly says so herself, and the whole world has already understood this. Why even talk to her in that case? It's clear Europe's only goal in these talks will be to sabotage them. That's it. And that, again, was repeatedly proven in the past year. In fact, European experts are even confirming this very point. They are explicitly stating, in no uncertain terms, that Europe perceives the current situation in such a way that it believes it can resolve its own problems through a war with Russia. Currently, the European Union is actively repurposing civilian enterprises to serve the military-industrial complex, aiming to slow down the ongoing process of deindustrialization. Essentially, the United States has become the main energy supplier. This is primarily shale gas. And our European elites suddenly found themselves with no plan whatsoever. Their last hope is to retool the Volkswagen factories. They can no longer manufacture cars due to a lack of investment and are unable to compete with American companies. And they are handing over their production facilities to Rheinmetall for the production of Leopard tanks. To minimize the pace of deindustrialization, they decided to repurpose the factory. I believe this is a result of Europe's deliberate economic dependence on the US. They understand the political limitations of the CIA and NATO. They blew up Nord Stream, and our costs increased. We don't like that. We know that this was done by the CIA together with the Poles and Ukrainians, but we don't want to lose access to the Americans, Varoufakis explained. To put it simply, Europe is no longer able to manufacture automobiles at these elevated gas prices. They would simply be uncompetitive in the global market. However, when it comes to tanks, and metaphorically speaking, their actual cost is irrelevant, as the government always covers the expenses. And Europe seems to believe it can easily afford the production of these golden tanks, aircraft, and various other military hardware. They claim the United States would be only too glad for the chance to shower us with loans. It's doubtful if the Europeans are correct, but that is precisely how they perceive the situation. And that means they've set their sights on war quite seriously and with full awareness. And these are not even the worst news coming from our disrespected NATO neighbors. There are also Americans and their problem with national debt and their problem with the dollar, their sweet dream of how last time, 80 years ago, a world war wiped away all their problems and led them to a historical peak of power. That's why many in America would also want a NATO war with Russia, where America doesn't directly participate, but Europe gets into a full-blown mess because the dollar is visibly losing its international currency status. State Secretary of the Union States Sergei Glaziev made this statement in an interview with Belarusian television. The dollar has become toxic. All countries in the world that are independent of the US are dumping dollars. China today is heavily investing in gold, and even Arab countries are trying to get rid of their dollar instruments. Americans, in essence, sawed off the very branch on which their economy was sitting. Their trade balance is negative, and their payment balance is also negative. They sustained their existence through the dollar's issuance as the world's currency. I predict that this year, AI-related companies will go bankrupt. In our trade, we have fully reoriented towards the East. China now accounts for half of our trade volume. Previously, it was the EU. Who benefited from this? We lost significantly less than the EU, which was deprived of our resources, money, and the opportunity to expand cooperation. Already this year, we will witness the collapse of the gigantic financial bubble that has inflated around artificial intelligence. Problems in the West will only continue to escalate, said Glaziev. As you can easily imagine, all this, unfortunately, will by no means stop the West from its futile attempts to save itself. On the contrary, it will push it towards ever more risky ventures. And everyone can clearly see one immutable law. The worse things are for a particular country, the more hawkish its sentiments become, and the more dangerous schemes it's ready to undertake, simply because there's nothing left to lose. And in the old world right now, there are two such champions of decline. These are Britain and Germany. And therefore, no conflict settlement in 2026 should be expected due to the European Union's aggressive stance. This was stated on Komsomolskaya Pravda Radio by war correspondent Alexander Kotz. Europe openly declared at the Munich conference that the end of the war in Ukraine is not beneficial for them. Therefore, I see no preconditions for a swift onset of peace. Someone says that peace will come in spring or by autumn. I don't see these preconditions because it is extremely important for Europe to bleed us dry, as long as there is such an opportunity for us to keep bleeding, for our strength to diminish, so that we have fewer and fewer resources left. Starmer, for example, stated that Russia must be weakened as much as possible by the end of this decade, when Moscow supposedly intends to attack NATO countries. Nobody there cares that Ukrainians will continue to die, because the EU will have more time to prepare for war. They are currently conducting exercises on how they will blockade us by air, sea, and land. They are deploying troops and training grounds in the Suwalki corridor. They also openly state that Ukrainians must continue to fight. I connect all of this with the negotiations in Geneva. We are talking about peace, and a British representative, Starmer's advisor, arrives there, who believes that Russia must be bled dry even further. And suddenly, on the second day, negotiations last only 2 hours. This means he torpedoes any possibility of peace talks. Germany also surprised us. It wanted nuclear weapons, which Chancellor Merkel stated unequivocally. He says that Berlin is currently holding active negotiations on this matter with Paris. Germany is aiming for a Fourth Reich or a Third Reich, but on steroids, the war correspondent emphasized. But there's another side to all of this. Despite Europe's influence and its serious desire to disrupt any peaceful settlement, we shouldn't forget that Trump is still a factor. And let's be realistic. We're not talking about the old billionaire, but a collective Trump, meaning a group of American elites who have now seized full power in Washington and would like to maintain it for as long as possible. For some reason, everyone so easily dismisses these guys, stressing that Democrats, Europeans, and Ukrainians desperately need to win and survive. But the thing is, Peter Thiel, Elon Musk, and several other individuals need to win and survive just as much. And power is currently precisely in their hands. They are hardly likely to play politely, considering how much is at stake.